So Camilla formally appealed to William to be included in the rooms where the future of the monarchy is actively being planned, and he said no. Not simply no, but a very specific kind of no that came attached with a clause designed to make absolutely certain she could never ask again. And the person who apparently made sure that clause existed in the first place was Princess Anne. That is the core of it. This is not just a family argument about hurt feelings. It is about who gets to be in the room when the crown actually changes hands, and who holds the power to lock that door from the inside. Before we get into exactly how all of this went down, make sure you subscribe to Crown Watch so you never miss these updates as they continue to develop. What makes this situation so genuinely unusual is that it did not begin as a public confrontation. It started inside a private planning meeting that was supposed to be about logistics, the unglamorous, behind-the-scenes work that keeps a monarchy functioning. Who handles which responsibilities, which offices communicate with which departments, how security briefings get circulated and to whom. William walked into that meeting expecting a routine discussion about transition planning, and arrived expecting clarity on structure. Camilla walked in expecting to be part of the conversation, just as she had been before. And then she made a single request that changed the entire atmosphere in the room without warning. She asked whether her consultation rights would continue once William became the one in charge. That sounds straightforward enough if you say it quickly. But when you slow it down and look at what was actually being asked, what she was really requesting was a guarantee. Not simply to be kept informed, but to have a formally recognized place within the decision-making structure of his reign. That is a significantly larger ask than it first appears. William did not agree on the spot. He acknowledged what she had done alongside King Charles, but he was not prepared to promise her influence over a structure he had not yet fully designed or established. Anne's reaction was even more direct. She closed her notebook and said clearly, "Then we settle the boundary." Everyone in that room understood she was not talking about a temporary or negotiable fix. She was drawing a permanent line. What is particularly significant is that William did not challenge her. He did not say, "Hold on, let us think this through more carefully." His silence in that specific moment mattered enormously, because it told and she had his full support to move forward. According to accounts that emerged later, and recommended that access to future planning be based strictly on constitutional role and active responsibility. Not marriage. Not personal history. Not emotional closeness to the sovereign. That single principle became the foundation of everything that followed. Camilla did not know it yet. But the rule that would eventually shut her out had just been written in that room. Months later, when Camilla finally discovered who had authored the safeguard, she did not send a message through aides or palace intermediaries. She went directly to Anne herself. No secretaries, no formal palace language between them, just the two of them alone in a room. She wanted to understand why a family matter had been converted into an irreversible structural rule. Anne's answer was considerably colder than Camilla had expected, because Anne refused the entire premise of the question. She said it was not punishment. It was structure. But Camilla pushed back and asked what that structure implied about her actual place within the family going forward. That is when the restraint between them began to crack. Camilla admitted something in that private conversation that she had never included in her formal appeal. She was not trying to control William's reign. She was afraid of isolation. She genuinely feared that once power shifted away from King Charles, every door that had taken her years of difficult work to open would slam shut simultaneously, leaving her physically present within the palace but entirely irrelevant to everything that mattered. That is the part that makes this whole situation feel far less like a calculated power grab and far more like a deeply human fear of being quietly erased. Anne listened carefully to everything she said. And then she said something that almost certainly hurt more than any raised voice or direct accusation could have. She said she had understood that fear from the very beginning. And that was precisely why the safeguard had to exist. William needed the freedom to begin his own reign without carrying obligations created by sympathy or by loyalties inherited from the previous one. But then came an even deeper and more painful revelation. Camilla learned that Anne's original recommendation had not remained untouched. William had reviewed it privately, accepted the underlying principle, and then personally strengthened the restriction beyond what Anne had initially proposed. So Anne drew the boundary. But William made absolutely certain it could not be moved. That distinction matters considerably, because Camilla had been quietly telling herself that and was the primary force pushing her out. The truth was harder to sit with. The future king had personally and deliberately chosen to close that door himself. William understood precisely what that authority meant. As the heir actively preparing his own household, he would ultimately determine who could enter the private planning structure surrounding his eventual reign. Anne's recommendation carried real weight, but she could not impose the final structure unilaterally. William approved it. He placed his name beneath the changes. He understood clearly that the consequences would eventually reach Camilla. King Charles confronted that reality in private. He read the briefing paper while William sat directly across from him, then set it down without speaking for several long seconds. He knew his wife would experience the restriction as personal rejection. The pain of that knowledge showed on his face immediately. But he also understood something considerably harder to accept. His son could not prepare an independent reign if every significant decision remained shaped by the emotional needs of the current one. King Charles finally asked, "Are you certain?" William did not look away. "I would not have signed it if I were not." What pushed William beyond Anne's original recommendation was a confidential internal review revealing that discussions belonging to King Charles' household had repeatedly overlapped with meetings specifically intended for William's future planning team. Names, appointments, communication strategies, they were crossing between two separate circles of authority. That is a genuinely serious problem when you consider the circumstances. One monarch still holds full authority. Another man is simultaneously preparing to inherit it. When those two worlds begin to blur together, a change of reign could produce dangerous confusion at the exact moment the monarchy most requires absolute clarity. William added his own specific protection to the restructuring. Any access removed under the new system could not later be restored simply because someone submitted a personal petition, and had argued that the boundary must exist. William ensured that emotion could not reopen it afterward. King Charles understood exactly what that meant for Camilla. She could no longer tell herself that Anne alone had pushed her outside the future circle. William had personally accepted the cost, strengthened the restriction, and taken full responsibility for what came next. From that moment forward, the decision stopped being Anne's battle. It became William's choice. And almost immediately, Camilla began discovering what that choice looked like in the reality of daily palace life. The cruelest part of any palace decision is often not the formal announcement. It is the morning that follows. Meetings still begin on schedule. Briefing folders still move through the corridors. Cars still pass through the gates. But suddenly, one name disappears from a circulation list. One chair is no longer required at the table. One expected private call simply never arrives. Camilla discovered that reality almost immediately after the restructuring took effect. She opened a revised schedule and noticed the absence straight away. A future planning meeting that had previously appeared among her expected briefings was simply gone. The new access rules were now being actively enforced, separating communications tied to King Charles' present reign from planning connected to William's future one. On one side, she still stood beside the king in her current official duties. Nothing had removed her place within his reign. But the future structure had begun moving forward without her. Camilla closed the diary before turning to another page. Her aide waited nearby, uncertain whether she would request an explanation or demand that the meeting be restored to her schedule. She did neither. "Leave it," she said quietly. The words were small. The surrender contained within them was not. King Charles found her later and understood immediately that something significant had shifted. She told him she could accept losing influence far more easily than she could accept the implication that years of loyalty had been rendered suddenly irrelevant. The king listened without interrupting. He knew her position remained secure beside him within his reign. But he also recognized that the decision had reached something far deeper than questions of status or access. It had touched her sense of belonging. William heard about that silence through a senior courtier's documented briefing. Camilla had refused to ask King Charles to intervene again. She had not requested another meeting. She had made no attempt to reopen the appeal through any other family member. William had expected anger. He had perhaps expected another direct challenge. What he received instead sounded unmistakably like resignation. For the first time, the true cost of his decision stopped being an abstract price of future leadership and became something painfully and unavoidably human. Anne recognized it too. In a recorded private conversation, she told William that firmness and cruelty were not the same thing, and that he now risked confusing the two. She still defended the restriction completely and without reservation. But she warned him clearly that allowing revised schedules, updated access lists, and formal administrative notices to deliver the final message would transform a necessary institutional boundary into something that felt like needless personal humiliation. That is a remarkably specific warning, coming from the person who had been the strongest and most consistent voice for the decision from the very beginning. If Evan believed the silence had gone too far, William could not simply ignore it. He finally agreed to speak with Camilla directly. No King Charles present. No one in the room. No officials standing nearby. No formal appeal document sitting on the table between them. No officials were present when William entered the room, and was absent. King Charles was elsewhere in the palace. Even the appeal itself had been left outside. For the first time since the crisis began, there was nothing between William and Camilla except the decision that had wounded one of them and weighed heavily on the other. Camilla did not ask him to reverse it again. Instead, she asked something far more difficult. She asked whether the rejection meant he no longer trusted her. That is the question that separates the institutional verdict from the personal relationship underneath it. William paused before answering. He said, "No. It is about where one reign ends and where another must be allowed to begin." Then he admitted his own mistake. He had managed the aftermath too coldly, because he had feared that showing any kindness would be misread as weakness or as uncertainty about the decision itself. He had wanted everyone to understand clearly and without ambiguity that the decision was final. But in protecting the boundary so firmly, he had allowed Camilla to absorb an institutional judgment as though it were a deeply personal rejection directed at her. He told her he respected what she had endured alongside King Charles and did not question her loyalty to him in any way. But his eventual reign could not begin with permanent influence guaranteed by relationships formed under the previous one. That was simply not a foundation he could build on. Camilla listened without interrupting. Then she made her own decision. She would not challenge the ruling again. She made clear that her acceptance did not mean the decision had stopped hurting. It meant she had finally come to understand what William believed he was protecting. That distinction changed the atmosphere in the room in a way that no reversal of the decision could have. Nothing had been undone. Yet something had been genuinely repaired. William later received confirmation through a documented palace account that Camilla had withdrawn any further challenge to the ruling. Inside the family, the conflict had finally softened. But outside the palace walls, the story had already escaped, and within hours, it had become the only royal story anyone wanted to discuss. By the following morning, what had begun as a private family dispute had transformed into a very public referendum on the monarchy's future direction. Some observers saw William's refusal as ruthless and unnecessarily harsh. Others saw it as the clearest proof yet that the next reign would operate entirely on his terms and his terms alone. Camilla became simultaneously a sympathetic figure and a powerful symbol of the tensions building around the transition of power. Anne's confirmation that the decision was genuinely irreversible transformed the story from a reported palace disagreement into something that felt like a final and formal judgment. William woke to a story that had already moved well beyond palace control. Broadcasters framed the rejection as the clearest indication yet that the prince intended to draw a sharp and permanent separation between his future royal household and the networks that had been built around King Charles' reign. Palace communications teams worked to steady the public reaction by emphasizing continuity. Camilla's present responsibilities alongside the king had not been touched or diminished. She still stood fully within King Charles' reign. What had changed was a guaranteed place inside William's future one. Camilla's supporters reacted with genuine anger, because to them, the distinction felt painfully cold. She had spent years beside King Charles under relentless public scrutiny, surviving open hostility, painstakingly rebuilding her public image, and carrying out her royal duties even when criticism followed nearly every public step she took. To them, restricting her future access looked like a remarkably harsh reward for long and difficult service. William's defenders answered just as forcefully. They argued that an heir who refused to establish clear institutional boundaries simply to avoid family discomfort would enter his own reign already compromised and weakened before it had even properly begun. William had not removed her present role. He had protected his future authority. Those were two entirely different things. Outside Buckingham Palace, the debate became impossible to ignore. A crowd gathered near the railings as television crews broadcast the story live throughout the morning. Newspapers appeared in people's hands, one front page dominating above all others. "William says no." The words ran above side-by-side photographs of the future king and Camilla. During one recorded street interview, a woman standing near the palace gates looked toward the building and told a broadcaster quietly, "It feels like the next reign has already started early." That single sentence captured the public unease more precisely than hours of expert commentary had managed to do, and suddenly became absolutely central to the developing story. Her confirmation that the decision was irreversible shifted the entire narrative. The Princess Royal had made clear beyond any doubt that this was not temporary institutional discipline designed to frighten Camilla into a brief retreat. It was a permanent structural boundary, and it had been set with full intention and full awareness of the consequences. King Charles remained sovereign. The Queen Consort remained beside him. Yet William's future authority had already begun clearly separating itself from the present court in ways that everyone, inside and outside the palace, could now see. Behind those headlines, the four people at the very center of the crisis had already reached a quieter and more private understanding. William had explained himself honestly. Camilla had withdrawn her challenge and had defended the boundary without abandoning basic human compassion. King Charles had begun the difficult process of accepting what the future genuinely required of him. The public saw winners and losers in clean and simple terms. But the real verdict had already been reached in private, and it was far more complicated and far more human than any simple notion of victory or defeat could capture. In the end, William did not reverse the decision and did not soften its permanence. Camilla did not regain the access she had worked so hard to preserve. Yet the ending was not the dramatic destruction that many outside observers had anticipated and predicted. Something considerably more difficult happened instead. Each person accepted a boundary they could not change. William accepted the true and lasting cost of authority. Camilla accepted that years of service and loyalty did not automatically guarantee permanent future influence, and accepted that protecting the institution still required genuine compassion alongside structural firmness. And King Charles accepted that the future could no longer be arranged entirely around the needs and relationships of the present. Camilla made her final choice in private. She told King Charles she would not ask him to intervene again. The king understood immediately the full weight carried inside those words. The appeal remained rejected. Her access to future succession planning meetings would not be restored. Those meetings, the confidential discussions used to prepare duties, formal authority, security arrangements, and household responsibilities for a future change of reign, would proceed without her. Yet the ruling had not erased her current position. She would continue serving alongside King Charles in every aspect of his present reign. What had permanently changed was the clear boundary drawn around William's future. Camilla looked at her husband and acknowledged the truth plainly, that forcing him to choose between protecting his wife and supporting his heir would cause far more lasting damage to the family and to the institution than accepting the decision ever could. King Charles took her hand. This time, he did not argue. William carried his own quiet discomfort into a final private conversation with Anne. According to a documented palace account, the prince admitted that rejecting Camilla's appeal had taught him something about the true nature of authority that he had not fully understood before sitting with the consequences. And listened carefully, because she had defended the restriction firmly from the very beginning. She told him that the irreversible clause had never been created to punish the Queen Consort. It existed because the next reign could not be repeatedly renegotiated through personal loyalties every time a difficult boundary caused pain to someone who had once stood close to power. King Charles completed the circle in a recorded private exchange with William, formally acknowledging his son's right to organize his future household entirely independently. That acceptance closed the last realistic path through which Camilla's restriction might realistically have been challenged or overturned. The king did not pretend the decision was without pain, but he recognized clearly what refusing to accept it would ultimately mean. William could not prepare to become sovereign while still requiring permission from the present reign to define the shape of his own future, and later confirmed formally that the matter was closed. William received the message, set the file aside, and did not reopen it. Camilla had withdrawn her challenge. King Charles had accepted the boundary. The Princess Royal had defended the structure throughout. The future king had accepted full personal responsibility for its human costs. The appeal had failed. The ruling had survived. And no relationship involved emerged entirely untouched. But the monarchy did survive, and that had never been guaranteed. Camilla lost her claim to a place inside William's future inner circle, while William gained something considerably heavier than any victory, the unmistakable and permanent weight of becoming the man who must one day decide precisely where one reign ends and the next one begins. What lingered after the formal closure was not open hostility or visible conflict. It was a careful, deliberate distance that settled quietly over everything. Camilla continued appearing beside King Charles at state occasions, maintained her official patronages, and fulfilled her public calendar without visible complaint. But those working closely inside the household began noticing subtle but unmistakable shifts. She no longer expected certain documents to reach her desk. She stopped inquiring about meetings that would once have included her as an unquestioned matter of routine. The palace made no formal announcement of the change. It simply became the new normal. And that quiet normalization may have been the most painful part of all, because it meant the boundary was no longer being actively challenged or even openly discussed. It was simply being lived with, day after day, in the ordinary rhythm of palace life. William, for his part, did not gloat. He did not reference the decision publicly or allow his team to brief against Camilla in any way. Behind closed doors, he described the episode as one of the most genuinely difficult responsibilities he had carried since becoming heir to the throne. He told a senior advisor that saying no to someone who had stood faithfully beside his father for decades had aged him in ways he had not anticipated or expected. But he did not apologize for the outcome. He believed the monarchy needed institutional clarity more than it needed personal comfort, and he was fully prepared to carry the consequences of that belief, even when those consequences wore a familiar face across the dinner table. As for Anne, she never raised the matter with Camilla again. The Princess Royal had absolutely no interest in revisiting a decision that had already been made, firmly defended, and formally accepted. In her view, the institution had withstood an extremely difficult internal test precisely because no one had been permitted to negotiate around a boundary after it had been properly set. She believed that showing genuine warmth was important, but showing absolute consistency mattered more. And in the weeks that followed, she made a deliberate point of treating Camilla with exactly the same professional courtesy she had always extended. No additional warmth, no lingering coldness. Just structure. Which was, in the end, precisely what Anne had promised from the very beginning. The public eventually moved on to other royal stories, as the public always does. But the precedent established inside those private planning rooms did not simply disappear along with the headlines. It now sits embedded within the machinery of the monarchy, quietly waiting for the moment when the crown passes and the next reign formally begins. Camilla will still be there, standing faithfully beside King Charles until the very end. She will still be seen at every occasion. She will still be respected. She will still be present in every public sense. But she will not be inside the room where the next chapter of the monarchy is being planned and decided. That door, once open to her after years of difficult and patient effort, is now closed. And because of the clause William personally approved and carefully designed, it cannot be opened again by any appeal, by any expression of sentiment, or by any appeal to the memory of past loyalty. It will remain closed. Not as an act of cruelty, but as an act of institutional clarity that one future king decided the crown could no longer afford to live without.